Welcome back to True Crime South Africa. I'm Nicole Engelbrecht, and this is part 2 of episode 199, The Crimes of Peter Frederiksen. If you haven't listened to part 1, you need to do that first and then come back here. If you've already listened to part 1, I won't keep you waiting any longer. Let's get back into it. In 2006, Peter Frederiksen arrives in South Africa from Denmark. His very entry into the country is a crime, because he is a fugitive and he has prior convictions which he does not declare. Unfortunately, these are either not picked up when his visa and eventually his residence permit are issued, or Peter encourages the person assessing his application to ignore this information by means of a golden handshake. Peter continues writing in his diary, and another pattern starts to emerge. Peter needs to constantly remain mentally stimulated, and the only way he seems to achieve this is by committing crimes or undertaking manipulative activities. The rush he seems to get from each of these events fades with increasing speed, and similar to a serial killer escalating, he seems to need more and more of his brand of enjoyment to keep him happy. He often writes in his diary that things have become boring, and it's time something happened. It takes Peter some time to get settled and put down roots in South Africa. While he does, he takes advantage of the kindness of others and lives with several families. In June 2007, he's living with an unnamed elderly widow when he writes that he is once again becoming bored. It becomes clear that boredom is an extremely dangerous experience for anyone around Peter. As Christmas rolls around, Peter's elderly host invites her family to visit. Peter tells both the journalists and writes in his diary about what happened next. He prepared a traditional Danish meal for the guests that day. Codfish stew seasoned with some special salts he had brought with him from Denmark. And he says he served about 4 vodkas to the elderly woman's son-in-law, Andrew. Andrew was a well-off businessman and someone that Peter would probably have been quite jealous of if we're to go by his previous behavior. Peter told the journalists that not long after they'd finished their meal, Andrew went outside for a cigarette and collapsed on the porch. He died before an ambulance could arrive. Peter claims he tried to give the man CPR, but there was nothing he could do. This incident was recorded in Peter's diary too. In that entry, he spoke about an expensive pen that the man's wife had given him after his death. After Peter's arrest, police found a photograph in Peter's home of a clearly deceased man. The man was lying on what appeared to be a porch and had a pillow under his head and a blanket pulled up to his chin. Beside him on the floor lay a gold-plated pen. Police sent the photograph to the journalists and asked if they could find any reference to this man in the diaries. The journalists immediately remembered Peter's story about the deadly lunch in 2007 and relayed the information back to the SAPS. The SAPS did reopen the docket around this man's passing, but when they discovered he'd been cremated, they couldn't move any further with the case. I do have the full name of the alleged victim in this case, but I didn't feel it would be fair to the family to publish it. I also recognize that it may get a little confusing with me jumping back and forth to tell you what the outcome of the evidence was found after Peter's arrest. But after weighing up various different ways I could present all of this, I decided this was the most concise. And anyway, you guys are smart. You'll have no trouble following along. Peter lodged with a few other families in Bloemfontein before he was eventually able to get his own townhouse. And he had 1 or 2 failed business ventures too, before he purchased Impala Arms and opened a branch in Lesotho. There is absolutely no doubt that from the history of his actions uncovered during the investigation, Peter was using his business for nefarious activities. At minimum, he was regularly using the lure of jobs to bring vulnerable women from Lesotho to South Africa for his own purposes. Sometimes he did let them work in menial positions at the stores for a while, but it wouldn't be long before he either sent them packing or they fled. In 2008, Peter mentioned a woman called Leneo in his diaries. He met Leneo in Lesotho and brought her back to South Africa with him. She lived with him in his townhouse for a few months, and then he began to talk about cutting her genitals. He told Leneo that she could only be with him if she was cut. Leneo refused, and after another few weeks of Peter trying to manipulate and coerce her into it, the woman fled back to Lesotho. The journalists would later track this woman down in Lesotho. She confirmed the details of her interactions with Peter and told them that he had not taken her rejection well. Leneo told the journalists that an attempt was made on her life, and she is certain that it was Peter who had done it. She barely survived, and after that, she went underground, changed the name she went by, and never returned to her home. But, as I've mentioned before, Peter did not let things go, and Leneo would hear from him again. While several of these witnesses were tracked down during the investigation after Peter's arrest, most were too scared to testify against him. In 2010, Danish authorities convicted Peter of the crimes he was charged with there in absentia. The judge ruled that if Peter was willing to return to Denmark to serve his time, he would be given no more than 6 months in prison. Peter told the journalists that he'd received this information, although he wouldn't say who had passed it on to him. But there was no way he was going to prison, he said, at the time. There is no real evidence about who in Peter's Denmark circles knew of his whereabouts. He would later claim that he had maintained contact with his wife and children, and even claimed to have snuck into Denmark through Sweden on a few occasions. His mother was still alive at this point, and he'd been very close with her, so it's likely he still maintained contact with her. We also don't know how much effort Danish authorities actually put into finding Peter. Honestly, I would think probably not much, because the crimes he'd been convicted of there were not terribly significant. Honestly, it's pretty terrifying that a foreign national fugitive with prior convictions for gun-related charges was able to buy and run 2 gun shops in Africa. Of course, he also provided false information on all of the pertinent license applications related to firearms, both here and in Lesotho. But he was using his real name and passport. It would become clear that Peter had developed a lot of connections in both the police and other departments in Lesotho and South Africa, which for a long time helped him to get out of a lot of situations he should have been brought to task on. 2010 was, of course, also the year that he met Anna and started his relationship with her, which from the outset was built on deception. His relationship with Anna was no different from his marriage to Vivian in terms of fidelity, in that there was none on his end. Vivian, of course, had no idea that her husband was having affairs and pretending to marry women in South Africa. Anna had no idea that Peter was continuing on a marriage with Vivian. Peter often sent Anna to Lesotho to stay in his property there and attend to matters at the gun shop. This was usually just an excuse to give him time to see other women, which according to his diaries happened frequently. Peter also began to document mutilations he carried out while Anna was away from home. He was quite meticulous about these records and would even note how much of which medication he'd administered to the victim and what the effect had been. He'd started to notice that as the medication he'd brought with him from Denmark aged, its effects were becoming less uniform. He made notes about which victims had woken up during the process, or not been sufficiently affected, and made suggestions to his future self about how to adjust the dose. Sometimes Peter would note down the first names of his victims. As a means of tracking down the victims during the investigation, this was unfortunately pretty useless, but sometimes there was other information investigators could use to figure out who was whom, and then DNA test the genital tissue found in the freezer to see if it matched any of those they identified. There were very few links made, though, and everyone involved in the investigation started to wonder if perhaps many of these victims were dead. In 2011, Anna gave birth to her and Peter's first son. To protect these children, especially since at least one would be eventually identified as a victim, I will not be naming them. Anna's daughter from her first relationship knew Peter, of course, and split her time between Lesotho and South Africa. Just days after the birth of his son, likely while Anna was still recovering from birth with her mother in Lesotho, Peter documented yet another mutilation victim in his diary, along with the details of the medication and dosage he'd used to drug her. In 2012, 4 years after Linneo barely escaped Peter with her life, the man made the following note in his diary. Quote, "Talk to Mishak. Now go after Thabo. Plan B happened in time." End quote. After some digging, the journalists were able to figure out that Thabo was Linneo's younger brother, and the young man had died in a hail of gunfire in 2012. The day after Thabo died, Peter wrote in his diary, "Plan B finished." Although he would never be convicted of arranging Thabo's murder, Linneo was certain that Peter had killed him to hurt her. Thabo was the plan B when he couldn't find her. 4 years later, he refused to give up on getting his revenge, for nothing more than the fact that she'd rejected him. Thabo's murder investigation soon ran cold. But still, Peter was not finished with Linneo. The following year, Anna gave birth to another son. Also in 2013, Peter made that threatening call to Inga in Denmark. At some point after the birth of their second son, Peter drugged and mutilated Anna. He told her that now that she was finished having his babies, she needed to be clean for him. The woman had already suffered psychological and physical abuse from Peter, and at some point it seems she had become aware of his mutilation of other women. She was in shock, felt deep shame, and was terrified of Peter. She did not tell anyone in her family about the mutilation at that point. It would later become clear that Peter began using their sons almost as a protective shield to ensure Anna did not report him. Whenever she would leave the country, he always insisted that at least one of the boys stayed with him. That way, if Anna decided not to come back or to lay charges against him, he would have the child as a bargaining chip. Anna was already desperate to divorce Peter and get away from him, but she had no idea how to do it without her children, or her family getting hurt. She knew well enough from prior experience that reporting him to police had no effect, except to anger him. She suspected he had contacts in both the Lesotho and South African police services. If she divorced him, she wanted to ensure that there would be no shared custody, as she didn't trust him to not harm the boys. During this time, Anna was spending a lot of time in Lesotho, and likely, unbeknownst to her, Peter had already started seeing another woman. Tembi had originally been an employee at the gun shop, but she soon started visiting Peter's home in December of 2013. By March of 2014, Tembi had been drugged while at Peter's home, and when she awoke, she found her genitals mutilated. Like so many of the other victims, Tembi kept the attack to herself for a long time. Her family members noticed she was subdued and seemed to be in pain, but she refused to admit that anything was wrong. By May, Tembi had quit her job and broken all contact with Peter Frederiksen. He was, by all accounts, including his own in his diary, furious. By August 2014, Tembi was dead. She had been asleep in her home when it had inexplicably caught fire, and she'd died. Neighbours reported seeing a white man running down the road just before the flames appeared on the roof of Tembi's house. This was the third woman in South Africa who had been involved with Peter Frederiksen and experienced an inexplicable fire at their home. Tembi's death was never properly investigated, and Peter was never convicted of her murder. Peter's diary recorded her death by fire. Again, not something that he would have necessarily known, as she had no contact with him for 2 months, and the fire was not reported in the media at the time. Peter's diary was quite full that year. He also recorded the death of a man who had worked for him. He told this story to the journalist too. His retelling surrounded the sudden death of an employee who had tried to do him in on a diamond deal. The man apparently passed away shortly after drinking a beer in Peter's presence. Again, Peter was never charged with or convicted of anything related to this man's death. The journalists were able to confirm that such a man had worked for Peter and that he had experienced a sudden death. In September of that year, Linneo was away from home when she received a call to say that her house had burnt down. She always suspected that Peter had been involved, and this had been another attempt on her life. On the day of that fire, Peter recorded in his diary that Linneo's house had burnt down. Again, there's no way he could have or should have known that if he had no involvement. Shortly after the fire that killed Tembi, Peter wrote in his diary, "Anna is upset about her clitoris." This is his first mention of the mutilation of his wife in his diaries. Peter Frederiksen appeared to be escalating his behaviours during this time, because in November 2014, he began a 2-week-long journal around another man named Peter. Again, I'm going to be leaving out the man's surname because Frederiksen was never found guilty of any crimes around this man's death. For clarity, I'll refer to Peter Frederiksen by his surname and the alleged victim by his first name. From the 7th of November, Frederiksen started writing about a dosage he was trying to work out. He made notes about having put a certain amount of a drug in Peter's beer and recorded the effects it had on him. This apparent guinea pigging of Peter continued without him seemingly noticing until eventually on the 27th of November, Frederiksen noted in his diary, "Peter is very sick." In December 2014, Frederiksen invited Peter to Lesotho for a business meeting. There, Peter collapsed and died from what police said was a heart attack. Frederiksen's final note on Peter's death reads, "They said it was a heart attack. It was actually poisoning, but they won't detect it." The deceased, Peter, was an accountant at Frederiksen's business, Impala Arms. In 2014 and early 2015, Anna was desperately trying to divorce Peter and get full custody of her sons. Peter kept their oldest son with him. By that time, the boy had just turned 5 and was probably more manageable for Peter than the younger child would have been. After Peter's arrest, it became clear that the child had been a victim of abuse. The journalists were the first to raise the alarm because they'd spent 3 days with Peter and his son, and they'd seen how aggressive he was toward the child. At one point, Peter was bragging about his thatching business in Denmark and showing them an old promotional video he'd put together. The boy had picked up the TV remote and accidentally pressed the pause button. Peter had exploded and smacked the child in the head with the remote control. The journalists had been shocked into silence and left soon after. There was also a suggestion, well, more than that really, of sexual abuse of the boy, which appeared to have started around the time that Anna was trying to get custody of him. Bizarrely, and I'm really jumping forward here, but stay with me, Peter would actually bring the proof to court himself and get his defense lawyer to show the judge the photographs. Police hadn't charged Peter with sexual abuse of his son, and there was no reason for Peter to even produce these images. He was, in fact, incriminating himself, but it seemed he was actually quite proud of the photographs. I'm not going to go into detail around the photos themselves, as they involve a minor and were never actually part of the official trial. It is clear, though, that Peter was taking his anger for Anna out on the child. He couldn't hurt her when he wanted to, so he would hurt the child. The Danish journalists are quite adamant on their podcast that this young boy should have been given justice, and I certainly agree with them. But there was still so much more to come, and Peter Frederiksen's horrors had only barely been revealed. In the aftermath of Peter's arrest, it would be proven that Anna had attempted to report the domestic violence she was experiencing several times in both South Africa and Lesotho. Each time, she was either not listened to or Peter had pulled some strings. In March 2015, though, her luck changed slightly when Peter went to Lesotho and assaulted her in her home. She called police, and he was arrested for domestic violence. At this time, he was on the radar of Lesotho police, despite Anna's claims that he had many in his pocket, as the month before, he'd been arrested, charged, and fined for being in the possession of an elephant tusk. Peter was released on bail and warned not to go near Anna again. Anna begged police for help in getting her son back to Lesotho, but she was told that there was no proof that Peter was a danger to the child. It seems that Peter realized that he might soon have to answer for some of his deeds. Anna was not backing down, and with the domestic violence arrest and the ongoing custody feud, he likely realized that having her killed would point straight back to him. And so, he did what anyone in that situation would do. Peter Frederiksen set about preparing for a documentary about his life. Forgive my small insertion of levity there, but this man is just so utterly infuriating, I can't quite help myself. But he really did. He figured out that there were 2 Danish journalists living in South Africa, and he contacted them and told them that he was a fugitive from justice in Denmark, and he had quite the story to tell, and he wanted to tell it to them. When John and Hella first got the call from Peter, they figured he was a bit of a quack. But the more they dug into his life in Denmark and all the allegations floating around there, and then listened to some of the bits and pieces he was telling them on the phone, the more they realized this may be an interesting story after all. The pair drove from Cape Town to Bloemfontein to spend 3 days with the man in June 2015. Of course, at that time, they didn't even know a quarter of what Peter Frederiksen was really about. When they drank beverages at his home and ate food he'd prepared, they had no idea about what was in the freezer, nor had they really put two and two together about his claims of having drugged people to death. It was only after his arrest, when they came into possession of those diaries, and when police shared certain other evidence with them, that it all really started to fall into place, and the true horror of what they'd been so close to actually sunk in. They also realized after reading his diaries that just 3 days before they'd arrived at his home, he had performed another mutilation, which was recorded in his diary. 2 months after the journalists had gone back to Cape Town with promises of another visit soon, Peter Frederiksen made a fatal mistake. He pushed Anna too far. Anna got a call from a child welfare social worker who wanted to speak with her. Peter had made some allegations about her mothering skills that the woman wanted to discuss. Anna attended the appointment, and in a moment of profound strength, which would have looked for all the world like emotional collapse, she told the social worker the whole story. All the things she had kept secret, even from her mother, for so long. The things she likely feared would get her killed if she shared them. And the social worker listened. And while I can't guarantee that she believed her, she actually did something about it. And so it was that the arrest in September 2015 of Peter Frederiksen, which has been our counterpoint all this time, came to be. Peter Frederiksen had finally overplayed his hand. Before we get to that arrest and everything that came after it, I want to introduce you to my anonymous source. Well, not literally, because that would defeat the object, but figuratively, I guess. This person knew Peter. Not closely, mind you, but they were in his close proximity and were able to comment on his general demeanour, what his neighbours thought about him, and provide some information about how Peter presented to the world. My source says they and others close to them got a really weird feeling about Peter Frederiksen from day one. Now, without outing this person, I will say that they are perhaps better placed than the ordinary individual to pick up such things because of some training they'd had. But the Danish journalists also said something similar. Essentially, the source did their best not to engage with Peter more than was absolutely necessary. The source also mentioned that their dog, who was one of those dogs who's never met a person they didn't like, had a very bad reaction to Peter. The source goes on to say that even though they tried to avoid Peter, his very presence, even around his own home, was one you couldn't really ignore. He would parade around his garden, which was open for all to see, in bikini brief-type underwear, and nothing else. Once the source realized that Peter was a foreigner, they considered that perhaps some of his weird behavior could be cultural, but that didn't change how they felt about him in their gut. The source mentioned that there were rumors that went around Bloemfontein about Peter possibly being involved in gun smuggling. Interestingly, the source mentions an incident in 2012 when they arrived home to find 2 police officers armed with very large weapons standing outside Peter's house. The source had quickly gone inside their own home, not wanting to get involved. Later that day, Peter had knocked on the source's door and claimed that the police had been there because his wife had been robbed and they were taking statements. This did not make much sense to the source, as it seemed to be much more of a serious situation. If I look at the timeline we now know about, this was around the same time that Peter had allegedly made his first attempt on Linneo's life and her brother Thabo was murdered. I did see mention that Peter had been suspected in the attack on Linneo and investigated, although that had gone no further. And some believed that Peter had pulled some strings and diverted attention away from himself. So this police visit could well have been connected to that. The source then went on to tell me about a neighbour of Peter's who was a very kind and generous older man. The man was also very trusting and a little naive. The source became aware that Peter had asked this older man if he could store some packages in his freezer. Already having suspicions that the man was up to no good and not wanting the kind neighbour to get into trouble, the source took the man aside and strongly suggested he make up a story about his freezer being too full and give Peter back his packages. At the time, the source thought the packages might contain smuggled items like drugs or diamonds. But of course, we know now what was actually in many of the packages in Peter's freezer, and very possibly in the neighbour's too. I have to wonder if around this time Peter had flown a little close to the sun again, and the heat had been turned up, and perhaps he expected another police visit, and he wanted to make sure he didn't have anything incriminating in his home. And then that afternoon in 2015 rolled around. The source describes the street outside Peter's home swarming with unmarked police cars, which would make sense because we know the Hawks handled the raid and the arrest. By that evening, the neighbourhood was abuzz with the story that Peter Frederiksen had been arrested and how they'd found some really strange things in his freezer. The source ends their time talking with me with a memory of conversations they'd have with friends around that time. The friends watched true crime shows together and often discussed whether they would know if they were living next door to a serial killer. Right up until Peter Frederiksen was arrested, they were all absolutely sure they would know. You'd have to, right? But after his arrest, the answer was no longer so clear. As information began to tumble out of the collapsed house of cards Peter had built, the two women in his life found out about each other. Anna realized that she'd been wasting her time all along trying to get a divorce from a man she was never actually legally married to, and Vivian reacted to the news of her husband's arrest and all the details around it in South Africa by immediately filing for divorce. Upon searching Peter's home, police found 21 packages of human tissue in his freezer. They were able to identify 7 distinct DNA profiles from that tissue. In addition to the diaries, police also seized reams of photographs which Peter had taken during the genital mutilations. In addition to those photographs, police also found images of child sexual abuse. The child in the photographs was identified as Anna's oldest child, the daughter she'd had when she entered into the relationship with Peter. The girl had spent very little time around Peter on her own, preferring to live with her grandmother in Lesotho. But it was clear from the horrific photographs that the little time she did spend with him was used by the man to abuse her. When social workers and police questioned the little girl, she admitted to what she had endured and said she hadn't told anyone because she was afraid of Peter. I will not go into what the images depicted, but suffice to say the act depicted was legally rape. The journalists, on request of the SAPS, scoured the diary for any entries correlating with this crime. Anna was able to give them an approximate time period to look at when her daughter may have been around Peter, and they eventually found a single entry. It said simply, "Pedophile pig." In addition to the photographs, police also seized video evidence. Although Peter would stick to his story that all of the women who he had mutilated had approached him and had the procedure done willingly, one video put that into serious question. It documented one of the mutilations he'd performed in his home. The victim is lying naked on Peter's bed, with a black refuse bag underneath her. Although the video would never be shown in open court, the judge would later comment on it, saying that he had seen many disturbing images in his career, but the savagery he'd seen depicted in that video would never leave him. Peter showed his true self in that video, belittling the victim, swearing at her, and clearly obtaining sexual satisfaction from the mutilation. The judge would later beg anyone ever considering releasing Peter Frederiksen at any point to watch that video before they did so. In addition to this evidence, police also found what seemed like additional trophies of his crimes. These included between 30 and 40 bags of pubic hair, which had been cut from his victims, and a box filled with champagne corks. Champagne was usually what Peter used to drug his victims prior to the mutilation, and he would keep each champagne cork and often write details about the mutilation he performed on the cork. He also had what appeared to be research about how World War II spies had been killed. Police were desperate to find the mutilation victims and made several public appeals for them to come forward. They did locate one or two, but these women either refused at the outset to testify or disappeared after police had spoken with them. Anna, of course, was more than willing to testify. Her eldest son had been returned to her care and she was with family in Lesotho. But as she told police, she did not feel safe. She was well aware that Peter had a long reach, and she had committed the most serious of offences in his eyes. Of all those Peter had sought retribution against, Anna certainly represented the worst betrayal in his eyes. Police would later say that they had offered Anna witness protection, but she declined. We'll never know if that is true. Peter was denied bail as he was clearly a flight risk and also a significant risk to the victims and witnesses. Then, on the 20th of October 2015, just months after she did the bravest thing and probably saved countless victims in the future, Anna Molise died in a hail of gunfire outside her home in Lesotho. The gunman escaped, and Anna died before any medical treatment could be rendered. There was absolutely no doubt in the police's mind that Peter was behind this. Rumours had also started circulating that Peter was trying to put a hit out on the lead investigator and the prosecutors. Of course, Peter denied knowing anything about the matter and expressed sadness at Anna's passing. He was moved to a more secure facility and placed in a single-person cell. Police looked into those he'd shared a cell with after his arrest and soon identified a man called Motlatsi Moketi as someone who had spent a lot of time with Peter. The man, who was a paraplegic and in a wheelchair after having been shot in a robbery he was involved in years before, had been jailed while he was awaiting trial for another crime unrelated to Peter. The men had met and, according to prison officials, spent a lot of time together until Moketi's release on bail on the 6th of October. After tracking his movements, as well as looking at evidence from illicit cell phones found in Peter's cell when he was moved, police were able to connect Moketi to the murder of Anna Molise. The man would later take a deal in exchange for immunity against prosecution and testified as a state witness. He admitted that Peter had asked him to have Anna killed, and he'd arranged individuals to carry out the crime in Lesotho. And it would be that last bit that held additional problems for the prosecution. Anna wasn't killed in South Africa. Although officials from Lesotho were cooperating with South Africans, an offender can only be charged and tried for crimes committed in the country they're being charged in. South African police and courts have no jurisdiction over crimes committed in Lesotho. The planning of the murder did occur in South Africa, though, and so conspiracy to commit murder charges were added to Peter's ever-growing charge sheet. Because of all the physical evidence they already collected, Anna's death was, of course, incredibly tragic, but did not seriously impact the case. And I don't think Peter thought it would, really. He didn't have her killed because he thought all his legal problems would go away if she died. For him, it was retribution. The motive that seemed to drive so many of his crimes, both proven and alleged. In addition, I have no doubt that he probably believed he'd beat most of the charges against him, and by killing Anna, he ensured that when he was freed, at least in his own mind, he would then have no more issues of shared custody of his sons. After Anna's murder, her daughter was taken in by her sister, and her boys were taken into the foster care system until their father's trial was finalized. Peter made several attempts to be released on bail, and each of his visits to court were filled with complaints about the conditions he was being held under. His bail applications were denied, and I couldn't help but think that maybe he should have taken those 6 months in a Danish jail after all. But Peter had made his choices, and now, hopefully, and finally, he would be facing the consequences of those choices. In amongst the investigation, both branches of Impala Arms were raided in a joint operation between Lesotho and South African police. After an in-depth analysis of the stock of firearms, the relevant licenses, and the sales records, police determined that at least 1,000 firearms were unaccounted for. They had been brought in as stock, but never sold, and their whereabouts were unknown. There were also hundreds of dodgy transactions listed in the shop records. It was something that the company accountant might have noticed too, and may have been able to assist police with, if only he hadn't died in Lesotho while on a business trip with Peter. From his arrest until April 2017, Peter did his utmost best to avoid his trial starting by delaying his acquisition of legal counsel. Lawyers came and went from his side, and at one point he told the court he was going to represent himself. The judge strongly advised him not to, considering the serious charges he was facing. Peter Frederiksen was charged with 58 different counts, among them rape, child pornography, assault with intent to do grievous bodily harm, bigamy, transgressions of the Health Act, fraud, transgressions of the Firearms Control Act, transgressions of the Prevention of Corrupt Activities Act in that he'd allegedly had his lawyer pay a witness not to testify against him, and conspiracy to commit murder. He entered a plea of not guilty to all charges. Now, if you, like me, would have thought that the acts of mutilation and being in possession of human tissue would have been a pretty clear-cut crime, you, like me, would be sort of mistaken, at least in the way it played out here. The charges that Peter faced for these specific crimes were divided into two groups, one for the identified victims and one for the unidentified victims. In both instances, the actual crime was the following: that Peter Frederiksen had removed human tissue from individuals without their written consent and did so outside of a medical facility setting. So essentially, because the mutilation victims were all believed to be adults, it wasn't technically a crime for them to consent to having their own body mutilated, if that had been the case. People do things like tattooing and piercing and other modifications all the time. And yes, it beggars belief that anyone would actually want this done, but legally an adult can pretty much do whatever they want with their own body, as long as they comply with the tenets of the Health Act to avoid any permanent injury or death. So if the women that Peter had mutilated had agreed to be mutilated, and they had given informed consent, there was technically no crime in that portion of the Act. However, the Health Act does require that consent be obtained in writing for this type of procedure, if you will. And legally, for safety, you must conduct the procedure in a medical or other sanctioned facility, like a registered initiation school facility where male circumcisions are concerned. So at the point of the trial starting, for the acts of mutilation, this is what Peter was charged with: not getting written consent and carrying out the mutilations in his home. Despite all of this, once the trial started, the defense applied all of the Health Act-related charges to be dismissed. The judge would apply his mind to this and eventually decided that, in his view, the National Health Act 61 of 2003 does not actually criminalize the removal of human tissue, in this case genitalia, without the person's permission, irrespective of whether it is done at an unregistered place. The judge believed that at the time, the legislature needed to take note of the legal shortcomings and rectify them. Quote, "Right from the start of proceedings, I had doubts whether the accused could be convicted on these counts, even if all the facts as relied upon by the state in the summary of substantial facts were proven. My view, which I articulated to the legal representatives in chambers, was and still is that the legislature failed to create criminal offences in respect of these transgressions." End quote. Essentially, the judge said that the Health Act was set up to guide medical professionals and protect patients, and that despite something being listed as a transgression of the Health Act, legislation did not exist to allocate a penalty to that transgression, nor to actually make it a criminal act. In other words, a transgression of civil law does not automatically equal a criminal act, unless legislation exists to make it so. As a result, all of the charges relating to the mutilations and the possession of human tissue were withdrawn. I will say two things about this, though. The first is that the withdrawal happened after one witness had testified about her mutilation. She was the only victim of the 7 known victims that testified, and she said that Peter had paid her to consent to the mutilation. Peter denied this, but receiving money in exchange for consent could be argued as a form of coercion. The other thing I will say about this is that these withdrawals created heated debate in the legal community around this case, and several academic reports were produced in the years that followed, showing that there were indeed other legal avenues that could have been used to convict Peter around these acts. Honestly, I do feel that the ball was dropped around these charges. But also, I see the complexity and difficulty when you do not have victims to testify. For me, it's quite clear Peter was not assisting these women in any way by mutilating their bodies. Anna said quite clearly that she did not consent in any way to being mutilated. Peter drugged these women in their champagne. Why would he do that if they had consented? If you consent to something and the person wants to give you drugs to lessen the pain, surely you'd take those willingly. From the video that was found, it was very clear that Peter was not conducting these mutilations as some sort of medical or cultural service. He was getting sexual satisfaction from the acts. I don't want the technicality of the law to in any way take away from what these victims suffered and what this man did. The shame so many of these victims experienced is akin to what so many rape survivors feel. Of course, that guilt and shame is not theirs to carry. But it shows that the trauma is similar, and the act was one of extreme violence. In August 2017, the court heard that an unnamed witness who was supposed to testify for the state about statements Peter had made to him in prison about his crimes was shot and killed. The missing and murdered witnesses in this case were adding up quickly. The Danish journalists testified in court about their translations of Peter's diary, as well as their interactions with him during the 3-day period they'd spent with him. They later said on their podcast that as they heard about witness after witness either disappearing or being murdered, they feared for their own lives. Moketi testified as a state witness and confirmed that Peter Frederiksen had hired him to arrange the murder of his wife, and he'd appointed 2 men to kill Anna. To my knowledge, neither of those men were ever located or arrested. Peter clearly found some perverse pleasure in the testimony around his sex crimes especially, and the mutilations. Although he didn't have to, and most accused don't, Peter did testify in his own defense. Over several days, he gave testimony to his own counsel and was then cross-examined by the prosecution. He insisted on interacting with some of the pieces of physical evidence, including sex toys. And as I mentioned before, he even had his lawyer introduce photographs which showed abuse he'd committed against his son, for which he was not even charged. The Danish journalists later said it was like he was enjoying the reliving and showing to everyone what a prolific criminal he was. Inga, the woman Peter had mutilated in Denmark, had told them that at one point Peter had said to her that his wife, Vivian, was the one in charge of the genital tissue, and that pattern repeated in court. With Anna not there to defend herself, Peter claimed that it was actually her who had instructed him to commit all of these mutilations, and she had kept the genital tissue in the freezer because she wanted to sell it to sangomas. This was not borne out by the evidence, and it was very clear that Anna was not some sort of criminal mastermind with a human tissue empire. She was a very scared young woman and mother, trying to protect her children. And as it turns out, she had every right to be afraid. On the 6th of November 2017, Peter Frederiksen was found guilty of all the charges against him, except for the medical charges, which had been withdrawn. The impacts on Anna's family and her daughter were emphasized in the sentencing hearing. The Molise family stated on record that they had remained afraid of Peter, and they knew full well that even when he was locked up, he was still very capable of carrying out a hit on their family in further retribution. From what we've learned about how Peter operated, the family is absolutely justified in this fear. The defense requested that Peter not be given a custodial sentence, citing his advanced age as a reason. The judge rejected this, saying that if Peter was young enough to marry a 22-year-old wife and have multiple affairs with other young women, he was young enough to go to prison. The defense also tried to minimize the rape of NM in ways which I will not detail, as it would reveal the facts of the attack. But suffice to say, the attempt was ludicrous and rather disgusting, considering the context of the crime, and the judge agreed, saying that there is no ladder of severity for rape, and the trauma of a child who has experienced the ultimate betrayal by a person who is in a caregiver role is equal to a grown woman who may have experienced devastating bodily harm from a physically violent rape. On the 16th of March 2018, Peter Frederiksen was handed down 2 life sentences, as well as a combined additional 51 years for the other charges. The life sentences were for the rape and conspiracy to commit murder charges. The additional years would be served concurrently with the life sentences, meaning that Frederiksen would be technically eligible for parole in 2043 at the age of 91. I say technically, because Peter Frederiksen didn't make it that far. On the 15th of September 2024, the Department of Correctional Services released a statement confirming that Peter Frederiksen had collapsed and died at Mangaung prison. On the 22nd of September, an article was published which included claims from fellow prisoners at Mangaung that Frederiksen had been beaten to death by prison guards. The DCS denied this, but said that a full investigation would be conducted into the man's death. In November 2024, a Danish journalist lodged an online request for an update from the DCS into this investigation. There was no response, and nothing has been publicly released about any findings. I am sure that the news of Frederiksen's death gave the Molise family some sense of closure. At least they no longer had to worry about him taking revenge from prison. In the Danish podcast that was published shortly after Frederiksen's sentencing, the journalist stated that the facility Frederiksen was being sent to, Mangaung, was one of the most secure in South Africa, and no one had ever escaped from there. That was, of course, technically correct at the time, as far as we know. Now, though, and I don't encourage this kind of thinking because honestly we'll drive ourselves mad. But we now know about Thabo Bester's escape in 2022. And if I was a survivor of Peter's crimes, I would certainly have a few concerns trickling through. But focusing too much on that very slim possibility continues to give this heinous individual power that he does not deserve. I will admit that this case almost did my head in. It was a combination of the vast amount of information, a timeline that spanned 3 full pages, with each event being captured on just a single line, very technical judgments, and incredibly vicious acts. But mostly, it was the vast number of victims, of so many kinds, who just got absolutely no justice. Of course, as I've continually reminded you throughout this podcast, most of these allegations have not been proven in a court of law. But I think you'll agree that there is a huge amount of evidence to say that at least most are true. I believe Peter Frederiksen was a serial murderer. And that is just my opinion. And maybe I'm only being brave because he's dead and can't sue me. But hey, Peter, if you're out there, feel free to prove me wrong. That documentary Peter wanted made about his life was actually made, but not in the way he wanted it. I think in addition to the lack of justice for so many victims, the other thing that really gets me about this case is the vast span of pain and trauma that's been left in this man's wake. Really, from when he was a child, already manipulating his classmates into letting him stick needles in their ears, to his sister, his wife, his children in Denmark, Inga, all the women in Denmark he mutilated and manipulated and used and abused. And then in South Africa, Anna, NM, his sons, Anna's family, Tembi, Linneo, Thabo, the other Peter, Andrew, the other employee, all the women whose genital tissues were found in his freezer, all the women he literally scarred for life. And those are just the ones we know about. It's unfathomable. It is absolutely clear to me that a predator like this would have selected South Africa and Lesotho as the places he decided to flee to, because he knew very well the countries contained an almost unending supply of vulnerable victims. While he was clearly able to pay off a few people in Denmark at times in his life too, he also knew that his money and guns would buy him leverage in South Africa and Lesotho. This predator was well aware of the privilege he wielded, and he used it everywhere he went. What this predator didn't account for, though, was the strength of Anna Matseliso Molise. When he targeted her, he made his gravest mistake. Because even in her greatest state of fear, when she was weakened to the core from fighting for her children, Anna was stronger than Peter could ever hope to be. He killed her, and her voice still echoed around the courtroom, within which his carefully placed house of cards finally collapsed. Anna Matseliso Molise and all the other confirmed and unconfirmed victims of this predator. Rest gently. If you'd like to hear more victim-focused true crime content, please subscribe to True Crime South Africa on Spotify or the platform you're using to listen right now. If you're looking for something still related to real-life stories, but often with a more positive slant, you can check out my new podcast series, I Lived Through This. You can follow both podcasts on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, thank you for your support, and I'll chat to you soon.